Picture yourself in London, 1305, standing on streets thick with the smell of smoke and the hum of a restless crowd. The air feels heavy, charged with something more than the usual market bustle. Today isn't about trade or celebration. It's about an execution, one so brutal it will carve itself into the soul of a nation. The man at the center of it all is William Wallace, a Scottish rebel who dared to challenge the mightiest empire in Europe. His name is whispered in awe and fear, a symbol of defiance wrapped in blood and legend. But what really happened on that fateful day? Why does his story still burn bright, centuries later? Welcome to Grim Chronicles, where we don't just retell history, we rip away the myths to uncover the raw, unflinching truth. Settle in, because this tale of courage, betrayal, and sacrifice is going to pull you into a world where one man's death became a fire no sword could extinguish. Let's step back to Scotland at the turn of the 14th century, a land battered by chaos and ambition. The Scottish crown was in shambles after King Alexander III's death in 1286, left no clear heir. Rival lords scrambled for power, their loyalties shifting like smoke in the wind. Into this mess strode Edward I of England, a king whose hunger for control was as sharp as his sword. Known as Longshanks, he wasn't here to play neighbor. He wanted Scotland as a province, another piece of his sprawling empire. By the 1290s, he was tightening his grip, propping up puppet rulers and demanding oaths from nobles who cared more about survival than honor. For most, bending the knee to Edward meant another day to breathe, to eat, to live. But not everyone bowed. Enter William Wallace, not a lord or a prince, but a common landowner with a spark of something dangerous in his heart. We don't know much about his early years. Records are thin, pieced together from chronicles and whispers, but we know he was from a place like Elderslie, a man whose family had been ground down by English rule. His father, some say, fell to English blades. His home was caught in the crossfire of a war he didn't start. By 1297, Wallace was done watching his world crumble. This wasn't about grand politics or noble titles. It was personal, a fire kindled by loss and fed by a vision of something greater. That vision came alive at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in September 1297. The English army, a juggernaut of armored knights and disciplined foot soldiers, marched north to crush the growing rebellion. They had numbers, training, and arrogance on their side, crossing a narrow bridge over the river, forth with the confidence of men who'd never lost. Wallace, alongside Andrew Moray, saw the trap they'd walked into. He waited, patient as a wolf, until half the English were across, then unleashed hell. The Scots swept down from the hills, cutting off the bridge and turning the river into a graveyard. Horses screamed, men drowned, and the English war machine broke apart. By day's end, Wallace had done the impossible. He'd beaten the unbeatable. Stirling Bridge wasn't just a victory. It was a beacon, a proof that hope could still flicker in a land under siege. That hope, though, made Wallace a marked man. Edward I wasn't just a king. He was a force of nature, a man who'd crushed Welsh rebellions and banished England's Jewish population with chilling efficiency. To him, Wallace's defiance wasn't just a challenge. It was a personal affront. Edward didn't just want to defeat him. He wanted to erase him, to make his name a warning carved in fear. The hunt for Wallace became an obsession, with English agents combing the Highlands, offering gold for betrayal, turning friend against friend. By 1305, most Scottish nobles had knelt to Edward, choosing survival over pride. Wallace's refusal to bend made him a ghost in their midst, a reminder of their own compromises. He moved constantly, a shadow slipping through the heather, keeping the rebellion's flame alive even as the noose tightened around him. In August 1305, near Glasgow, the end came, not in battle, but through treachery. The details are murky, but many point to Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who'd sworn allegiance to Edward, as the one who handed Wallace over. Shackled and caged, the Lion of Scotland was dragged south to London, a journey designed to break him before the real punishment began. Crowds lined the roads, some jeering, others staring in silence at the man who'd defied an empire. This wasn't just transport. It was a parade of humiliation, a calculated assault on his dignity. But Wallace didn't break. His eyes, they say, stayed fixed on something far beyond the chains, as if he already knew his story wouldn't end with Edward's victory. The streets of London were electric with anticipation as Wallace was brought to Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305. The trial was a farce, a performance in Latin he likely couldn't follow. Charges of treason, murder, arson, and sacrilege were piled high, each one crafted to paint him, not as a rebel, but a monster. Wallace stood tall, his voice cutting through the hall. I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. Those words were a blade, slicing through the crown's claim over Scotland. But the verdict was set in stone before he ever spoke. The sentence was a nightmare, to be drawn through the streets, hanged, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. Each step was symbolic, designed to strip away his humanity, to make him a lesson in blood. As the crowd outside swelled, hungry for the spectacle to come, Wallace was led away, his fate sealed but his spirit unbroken. The morning sun rose warm and merciless over Smithfield, where a scaffold stood waiting for its grim purpose. The streets were a sea of faces, merchants, children, nobles, all packed tight, their voices a mix of excitement and unease. Vendors hawked ale and roasted meat, turning death into a carnival. Wallace was brought from the tower, stripped bare, his body already torn from being dragged over cobblestones. Tied to a wooden hurdle, he was pulled through the city, blood marking his path like a scarlet thread. The crowd jeered, throwing filth, their laughter sharp and cruel. Yet Wallace gave them nothing. No cries, no pleas, just a silence that seemed to mock their noise. His eyes, witnesses said, looked past them, fixed on something eternal, as if he'd already left this world behind. At Smithfield the scaffold loomed, built high so no one would miss the show. The executioner, hooded and methodical, was no stranger to death, but this was no ordinary killing. Wallace was unbound, his wrists and ankles tied tight, and hoisted by the neck. The rope wasn't meant to grant a quick end. It was tied to strangle, to make him suffer. His body thrashed, chest heaving, face twisted as he fought for air. The crowd watched, some cheering, others frozen, as the man who'd humbled an empire became a gasping figure. But Edward's plan wasn't to let him die yet. Just as consciousness slipped, the rope was cut, and Wallace crashed to the boards, alive, shaking, clinging to life. The executioner stepped forward, his blade small but precise. What followed was horror beyond words. The knife sliced into Wallace's abdomen, blood gushing onto the platform, soaking the wood beneath. The crowd gasped, some turning away, others leaning closer, caught in a grotesque trance. The executioner reached inside, pulling out intestines, stomach, bladder, each organ held high like a prize before being tossed into a fire beside the scaffold. In medieval belief, these weren't just flesh. They were the seat of compassion, of humanity itself. Burning them while Wallace watched, still conscious, was meant to say, "You are nothing." Yet he didn't scream. His body writhed, his breath came in gasps, but no cry for mercy passed his lips. Some say he prayed, others that he cursed in silence, but whatever moved his mouth, it wasn't surrender. The final act was swift. An axe gleamed in the sunlight, and with one stroke, Wallace's head fell, rolling across the boards. The crowd roared, a mix of triumph and shock, as the head was raised, blood dripping, its once fierce eyes now slack. But the spectacle wasn't over. The executioner laid the body on a block, carving it into 4 parts, each one displayed like a butcher's cut. The head was dipped in tar, destined for London Bridge, a grim warning to all who passed. The limbs were packed for Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, each city chosen to carry Edward's message, "Defy us, and this is your end." As the crowd dispersed, some laughing, others silent, the air felt heavier, as if the world itself knew something had shifted. For a moment, Edward must have thought he'd won. In the weeks after, Scottish resistance seemed to falter. Men hid, leaders knelt, and fear hung over the land like a fog. Wallace's death was meant to be the end, a final blow to crush the rebellion's spirit. But Edward miscalculated. The savagery of that day didn't extinguish the fire. It fueled it. In the glens and villages, whispers spread, not of defeat, but of defiance. Wallace's silence on the scaffold became a shout, his pain a rallying cry. Around fires and hidden gatherings, his story grew, carried by those who'd seen or heard of his final stand. Among them was Robert the Bruce, a noble who'd wavered between resistance and submission. Wallace's death was a spark, a reminder that freedom wasn't a dream but a fight worth dying for. By 1306, Robert the Bruce had crowned himself king, picking up the banner Wallace left behind. The Scots fought harder, their tactics sharper, their mercy for English captives gone. Wallace had shown them what mercy looked like under Edward's rule, and they'd never forget it. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, a crushing Scottish victory, was built on the foundation Wallace laid. His death hadn't broken Scotland. It had forged it, turning a fractured land into a nation with a purpose. But the impact stretched beyond the Highlands. Across Europe, kings and chroniclers noted Edward's brutality, his willingness to go to unspeakable lengths to crush a single man. It gave England a reputation, not just as powerful, but as ruthless, a stain that would linger long after Edward's death. The records of that day are chillingly clear. English chronicles, like the Lanercost Chronicle, describe the execution with clinical precision. The steps, the crowd's reactions, the careful choreography of pain. These weren't meant to honor Wallace, but to glorify Edward's triumph. Yet even their cold words betray a flicker of awe. Scottish accounts like those of John of Fordun paint a different picture, not of horror, but of reverence. To them, Wallace was unshaken, a man whose silence spoke louder than any scream. Were these stories polished by time? Probably. But they carried a truth deeper than facts. Wallace's death gave Scotland a soul. The legal documents from the trial, preserved in England's National Archives, lay it all bare. The charges, the verdict, the orders to scatter his remains. This wasn't random cruelty, it was propaganda, each limb a message to Scotland's cities: we own you. But instead of fear, it bred unity. Those grisly relics became symbols, not of defeat, but of sacrifice. Wallace's death was a crucifixion, a moment that turned a rebel into a martyr and a scattered people into a nation. The scars of that day didn't just mark Scotland, they reshaped the world. In medieval times, death was common, but this kind of death, this ritualized destruction, was something else. It wasn't just about killing a man. It was about erasing him, stripping away his humanity to cow a nation. Yet, it did the opposite. For the Scots, Wallace's execution was a shared wound, a trauma that bound them together. His story became their story, sung in ballads, whispered in prayers, carried into battles. It gave them a moral compass, a sense of who they were against the shadow of an empire. In the centuries that followed, his name became a touchstone for Scottish identity, a reminder that even in defeat, there's power in standing tall. But the echoes didn't stop at Scotland's borders. Wallace's death sent ripples through time, touching ideas we now take for granted. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as thinkers began questioning the limits of state power, his execution was cited as a cautionary tale, not of rebellion, but of tyranny. The brutality of hanging, drawing, and quartering became a case study in how far a state could go to crush its enemies, planting seeds for modern notions of human dignity and rights. It's staggering to think that a medieval rebel's death could influence the laws that protect us today, but that's the weight of a story like this. It doesn't just belong to one people or one time. It speaks to anyone who's ever faced power and refused to kneel. And that brings us to the heart of why Wallace's story endures. He wasn't a king or a saint. He was a man, flawed, fierce, driven by something bigger than himself. His execution was meant to be his end, a final act to wipe him from history. Instead, it was his beginning. Medieval ballads turned him into a folk hero, their verses weaving his name into Scotland's soul. By the 19th century, poets and historians were crafting him into a symbol of national pride. And in 1995, Braveheart brought him to the world, inaccuracies and all, capturing the raw emotion of his defiance. The film may have added blue face paint and a Hollywood sheen, but it nailed the core truth. In death, Wallace became more than he ever was in life. His story isn't just Scottish, it's universal. It's about the lone figure standing against a force too vast to fight, yet fighting anyway. It's about the courage to say no when the world demands yes. That's why his name still resonates, why it's invoked in songs, books, and films. The method of his execution, hanging, drawing, and quartering, has become a byword for cruelty, a reminder of what power looks like when it's unchecked. It wasn't just punishment. It was a ritual, a stage where Edward meant to cast Wallace as the defeated villain. But Wallace refused the role. He didn't beg, didn't curse, didn't break. In his silence, he stole the crown's victory, turning their spectacle into his triumph. Edward thought he'd won that day in Smithfield, thought he'd crushed the rebellion for good. He died 2 years later, in 1307, still battling to hold Scotland. His empire faltered, while Wallace's legacy grew. The Scots, led by Robert the Bruce, would win their freedom, at least for a time, and Wallace's name was etched into their victories. The English wanted him forgotten, but they made him immortal. Every cut, every burn, every piece of his body sent across Scotland was meant to scream submission. Instead, it whispered resistance, a call that's never faded. So here we stand, looking back across 7 centuries, and Wallace's story still speaks. It's not just history, it's a challenge. Tyranny doesn't always come in armor or proclaim itself with trumpets. Sometimes it hides behind laws, behind order, behind promises of safety. But when it reveals itself, it's the voices that refuse to be silenced that show us the truth. Wallace didn't die for fame or power. He died for an idea, that freedom is worth any price, that no king, no empire can take away your right to stand tall. His body was torn apart, his name cursed by kings, yet he endures. Not for how he died, but for what he lived for. Thanks for walking this dark road with me on Grim Chronicles. This story of William Wallace isn't just a tale of blood and betrayal. It's a reminder of what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. If this moved you, if it sparked a thought or a feeling, drop a comment below and tell me what you'd stand for. What fire burns in you? Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Grim Chronicles for more stories that cut through the shadows to the heart of the truth. Until next time, keep searching, keep questioning, and never stop fighting for what matters. See you in the dark.